Welcome to Rehash, a Web3 podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Rehash, a Web3 podcast. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and in this episode, we are going to be talking all about the Metaverse. We've got Brenner Spear here, founder of Metagame, to talk to us all about what that is and talk about his thoughts about the Metaverse as well. So welcome, Brenner. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Of course. So before we dive into all things Metaverse and Metagame, can you let listeners know a little bit about your background, maybe what you were doing before Web3 and how you initially fell down the Web3 rabbit hole?
Yeah, so I started paying attention to crypto in 2016, right before the election. It's the first time I bought Bitcoin. I figured no matter who got elected, the world would be upset about it and buy Bitcoin as a hedge. That's not really what happened at all, but it was still a great time to buy Bitcoin and a great time to start paying attention to crypto. And I was living in San Francisco at the time and had a lot of friends that worked in crypto. And so that's kind of how I started paying attention. From 2017 to 2020, I worked at a company called Affirm as a software engineer and then product manager. And so during that time, I was keeping tabs on crypto, and people at work knew me as like, oh, Brenner, talking about crypto again. But, wasn't actively building really in crypto. And then winter of 2020, when the Beeple sale happened and people were like getting all excited about NFTs, kind of having them go more mainstream. In my mind, that's kind of when mainstream kicked off, is when I started to think, okay, now crypto finally has a use case. I think finance, both DeFi and centralized finance, are a means to an end, and finance can't exist by itself. It has to finance something. And so in crypto, there wasn't really anything to finance yet. So people were just building DeFi for the sake of DeFi, which there's nothing for DeFi to interact with. But then when we started to have NFTs and people started to basically show, and similar to fine art of like, oh, I care about this thing and I want to show off that I care about this by spending money on it and kind of show who I am through these purchases, I was like, okay, finally, this is a use case that is going to start to take off. And so I think that's kind of when I was really starting to pay more attention and then started building last summer.
Very cool. Yeah, we'll get into the NFT stuff in a bit. And that's interesting that you said when you learn about NFTs, you were like, now this is a real use case, because I think one of the biggest criticisms I've heard about NFTs is that there is no utility and no use cases. And so we'll have to talk about that later on in this episode. But to start out, I want to talk a little bit about the metaverse. So you got into crypto back in 2016, you learn about DeFi, learn about NFTs, and then at some point, this idea of the metaverse clearly, appealed to you and sort of got you interested in learning more about it. I've heard you define the metaverse as sort of three things that encompass the metaverse, and that's access, status, and entertainment. And I thought this was a really interesting definition of the metaverse, just because everybody, I think, is talking about a different thing when they throw around the word metaverse. So I'd love to hear where your thinking is coming from with these three things: access, status, and entertainment. What do you mean by each one? And why do you think that these three things are the three things that really embody what the metaverse is?
Yeah, so I've been using the word hyperverse because I think one, Meta, the company, is probably going to try to take over the word metaverse, and two, hyper as in hypertext. I think in the hyperverse, you'll be able to just go directly to wherever it is, similar to hypertext links. And I would say those three things are more about what matters in the hyperverse rather than like what embodies it. I think that in the long term, hyperverse is basically the Matrix, which is like, I think the first like really futuristic movie that I ever watched as a kid. And, we're not there yet, but I don't see any reason that we won't be within our lifetime, kind of tying into simulation theory, etc. But I think that in a hyperverse where everything is open source, everyone can have a mansion, everyone can live at the beach, everyone can throw a big party with lots of crazy lights and fireworks, etc., because all of that is basically costs no money. And so in that world, what things actually matter? In a world where everyone has as much stuff as they want, what are people going to look for? And so I think that those three things, access, status and entertainment are the things that people will look for and in the end pay for. If everyone has a mansion and lives at the beach, what are they paying for? I think that that's it, in terms of like horseshoe theory, we're getting back to, I feel like I'm on the capitalist side of the horseshoe and I have friends on the socialist side, and at some point it's like, oh, if everything is provided for everyone, then like what are we going to be doing? But I think back to those three things, it's access. Like people want access to private spaces, or in another word, community. Oh, am I allowed to be part of this community? And so either people will pay for that or in some ways earn their right to be in a given community. The second one, status. People want to show off, oh, I have something that is scarce. And a lot of what we've seen with 10K PFPs is artificially scarce NFTs. Someone said, okay, there's only 10,000 of these, and like to be part of this club, you have to have one of those. I think there's other things that are naturally scarce, like how many people in the world have climbed Mount Everest. That's a naturally scarce number of people. And so I think that the status of either having something or having done something is something that people will strive for. And then third, entertainment. I think people will continue to want to be entertained and will pay for novel versions of entertainment, especially if they get to experience that entertainment before other people. So those are kind of the three things in my mind that will matter in the hyperverse.
Gotcha. Okay, so I do have some follow-up questions to that. I guess the first is sort of your premise that in the hyperverse, everyone will have access to everything or whatever they want. If you want a mansion, you can have a mansion. If you want a Lamborghini, you can have a Lamborghini. How is this made possible? Because I would imagine that if this world shifts to becoming increasingly more digital and we're seeing these digital spaces come up, that digital land will cost money just like physical land will, and digital mansions will cost money, digital Lamborghinis will cost money as well. And so how can we, I guess I'm just curious to hear your thinking around like where does this like plentiful supply of things come from?
Yeah, so I think that just like everyone can have a Twitter account and like everyone can play SimCity and have their own city, that'll be the same, but for your like world, basically. I think Nifty Island is an example of a like metaverse, hyperverse world building app world that everyone gets their own island and you can put whatever you want on it. And really, what will end up starting to happen is if you have lots of people coming to your island, that takes more server costs, and so then maybe you'll have to pay to be able to have 1,000 people on your island at a time, like players playing on that island. But in terms of a mansion, like you can just download the mansion file and plop it onto your island, and now you have a mansion. And so code being open source, and really code is all it is that you need to have a digital mansion or digital Lamborghini, that is free. And I think that if Lamborghini were to say, oh, there's only 1,000 of these specific Lamborghinis that are like stamped by the Lamborghini company, in similar ways do we have punks and then funks, and funks aren't actually punks, but someone else made them, and so like they definitely have different weights and they sell for different amounts. But that ties into that status piece. People want a punk instead of a funk because it says something. It says, oh, I actually care, and I either was early enough to have a punk or I'm willing to pay enough to get a punk now. And that's different than funks, even if they look identical.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think I was more thinking about like what we have today on, for instance, Decentraland or crypto voxels. And if you want a piece of land there, you do have to pay for it. But in the future, it is like like thinking about the metaverse is always a fun exercise and thought experiment because I think our minds are naturally still stuck in the present day and the past, and it's hard for us to think in terms of the future. And so I think in the future, as is true with all technology, when it's a brand new technology, it's always sold at a premium price. It's really expensive. And then over time, it becomes more accessible to the masses. So that makes a lot of sense. And then the other piece, I was also wondering with regards to entertainment, I guess this is another related question because my mind has a hard time going into the future because it keeps getting stuck on what we have today. What are some novel forms of entertainment that you could imagine us having in the future?
Oh gosh, I feel like this is of the categories the one I have like the least amount of creative thoughts on. New video games come out and like the you know shooter ones are always people always love those because it's kind of like basketball games. Like you can play the same map or the same thing over and over again, but it's new people and like new stuff happens. And so I think that type of entertainment just continues. But there's other ones where it's like I forget what that game is where you're like a little person running and you have to there's like 100 of you and only 60 of you make it to the end and then there's another round and you etc. So just kind of anything that's like what was that quiz one that happened at the same time every day, maybe twice a day?
Oh, I know what you're talking about. And there was this guy that like narrated it and he was really animated. I know exactly what you're talking about. I just can't think of the name.
Yes. But things like that that are like, kind of fun. And I think a large piece, I mean, people play games by themselves, but I think a large part of this is games together, like Among Us and things like that. So to some extent, I'm like, okay, I'll leave that to the game developers to continue making like new fun stuff for people to play all the time. But then as making games gets easier and easier, people like everyone will be able to make a game. And I know someone that's building something that basically lets you remix stuff like that. It's called Playbyte. It starts with one version and then you can change some parts of it, like a Mario map or whatever, and then you can change some pieces of it, and then people play that version. And so like it's kind of like TikTok but for games. And so you remix these games and the most entertaining ones, people like kind of float to the top.
Yeah, I definitely think that like remix and co-creation and multiplayer stuff like that's really gonna, I think, explode over the next few years. What other trends, I'm curious to hear, do you see sort of like blowing up in the metaverse? Like once the metaverse becomes more prevalent, that we're all living in it more than we are today?
That's a good question. I would say the hyperverse that we have today generally is Twitter. Like everyone is there. It's the public square. Things that happen in real life, you then talk about on Twitter. You can tweet at anyone you want. A lot of people's DMs are open, and so you can kind of just have conversations. And so I'm trying to think, okay, what's like an even stronger version of that? I think until things get really good from like a 3D perspective or just synchronous stuff, I think a lot of hyperverse stuff will be async in that way to some extent. I guess Twitter is kind of a hybrid of both because you can have tweets show up immediately, so you can have like a synchronous chat conversation, but then it's there for other people to see later. I guess you can have that in Discord, but it's like who scrolls up. I guess there's no like top Discord posts naturally versus like you can see top Twitter posts in the last 24 hours or whatever it is. But what will people start to do more? I don't know. More of what they already do now, which is, I guess, just talk to other people. And I don't spend much time on TikTok, but I feel like people do, yeah, a lot of remixing stuff there and create entertainment on top of other people's entertainment. So yeah, and play more games, I guess.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see, that's for sure. And then the last question that sort of came to mind with this is something that we talk about so much in Web3 is this idea of ownership, right? That Web3 enables us to actually own the things that we create, and not only that, but to own our own digital identities, which arguably we don't own today. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts around like how the metaverse will, or I keep saying metaverse, but hyperverse, how the hyperverse will enable us to have more ownership over our digital identities and our reputation and all of those things.
Yeah, I think that it'll has to be a continued conscious decision by lots of builders for that to be the case and for consumers to care about that. And for them to care about it, there has to be incentives for people to care about it or they won't. Like Facebook could build the hyperverse in that case, it'll be the metaverse. and they could own all of it and own all of the data and all of what you've done, and they likely will build that, and a lot of people will likely use it. But in my mind, the hyperverse is not synonymous with owning all of your own data. I think that only comes if we build things in a way where there are standards of places that you can use and take that data, accept it, and you have a way to store it for yourself. And that we build tools like that, and we build more things open source and more things out in the open on standards that get adopted by a lot of different platforms rather than centralized platforms.
Gotcha, that makes sense. Okay, so I want to get into Metagame. This is the company that you've been working on for how long now? The last year or so?
I think I didn't really start writing code until September. And then between September and February, I did 3 different earned NFT experiments called Birth Block, Token Garden, and Heartbeat. And then since then have been working on EVM Translator, which is a open source way to decode and interpret any EVM transaction.
Okay. Yeah. So I think I originally heard about Metagame through Token Garden, which I thought was a super cool project, and we'll get to that in a second. But just for people who've never heard of Metagame before, I want to start with, what is Metagame? And I think the sort of explanation that I've seen written on Mirror and on other places is this. I'm just reading it off of your Mirror pages. Metagame's long-term vision is to create the stable infrastructure, environments, and tooling required to foster the emergence of values-based communities with religious levels of alignment. Values are truly defined by one's actions, and the truest actions are signed by a private key. So there's a lot going on there, and I'd love to hear you sort of break that down for us and explain each of the different components.
Yeah, so I'll start with the values-based community piece. I think that to some extent that like the internet has enabled a lot of things. I think one of the big things has been for people to find a community that they want to be a part of. And for myself, for instance, I started using Twitter more actively in 2016, and that's when I started to make some of my now closest friends on Twitter. And I think a lot of us now make a lot of our friends on Twitter. And so looking back, I now feel like I was living in the future back then, as more and more people now start to make friends on the internet, especially people that might live in somewhere more remote, like a town versus a city, where they can't necessarily find the people that they relate to that well in a place with a smaller population. And so they go online and they follow their interests, and they start to find people that have the same interests as them and say, oh, wow, I relate to these people a lot more. Like, I either want to spend time with them on the internet, or I'm sure people are starting to choose what college they go to, what area they go to based on, oh, I met these people and I really like them and they're going to go to this college, and like we're all into the same stuff. And I think crypto to some extent has built on top of that even more to find people that are aligned, that then have the same tokens. And then I think 10K PFPs have been an even iteration on top of that, which has been, oh, we all like the same aesthetic, or oftentimes I don't think people even really care about the aesthetic at all. It's just somehow that is the project that they decided to take a jump into and say, oh, I'm going to mint this one, and like these are going to be the people that I like experience crypto with to the first time to some extent. And in some ways, that's even more religious or faith based than a values based community or a religion is. Like they jump in and they say, okay, we're all here. And generally, the goal is to make the number go up. However, they're going to do that. And so I think that that's proven a lot in terms of what crypto can do and the communities that it can bring together. I think the next level on top of that is being able to bring together communities that have the same values. And on the next level of that is provably have the same values, that have done things that prove that whatever the goal or like the stated value set of the community is, they're part of that. And so I just think about some of these like climate DAO or climate change related ones, and it's like, okay, well, maybe there could be a DAO where you can only join that if you provably recycle every day and you have donated to whatever cause, pick one of 50, and once a month you go to the beach or wherever you are and you clean up trash or something like that. And like that is the requirements to be part of this DAO. And so, or NFT project, etc. And I think that those communities, people that have shared values, will be able to reach bigger, loftier goals than communities who are purely faith-based but don't necessarily share values.
Gotcha. Okay. And then I'm going to let you get to the rest of that too. But on this topic of values, so sort of what you're envisioning in the future is that our values can be derived from our on-chain data, right? And so that's like sort of hard for me to, that's like another thing that's sort of hard for me to imagine today, because if you look at my wallet transaction, it's like, great, I bought some NFTs, I did like some stuff, and you really like, I don't know how much you can really tell about me or my values based on my wallet transactions. So can you sort of like help us understand how maybe in the future we can actually find out something about somebody's values based on their on-chain data?
Yeah, so I think that the on-chain activity is a tiny slice of the data that you generate. And within all the data that you generate, a very small slice of it is recorded in any given way at all. So I think that Metagame has started with on-chain data because it's the most independently verifiable data that exists. Everything you do on chain is signed with a private key, and all of that data is available to check as long as you have access to a node. And so I think that keeping that level of independent verifiability is important as we start to add more and more data sources to what your like total noticeable actions are, basically. But I'm actually more interested in a lot of the Web 2 data that's contributory or points to your values more than what just your on-chain activity is. And in some world, maybe more and more data starts to go on chain, but in no world does all data go on chain. That's not true. There is some world in which all data goes on chain, but I don't necessarily think that that's the world we'll get to. But I'm more interested in things like GitHub contributions and governance proposals, etc., that are already in provable formats, and then working to bring lots of other types of data that aren't necessarily signed by a private key right now, but we can start to make ways for it to be more trustable. I think the reason I care a lot about this being trustable is to make it the least gameable possible. I think that everything is gameable, and if you make it a game, people will game it, and so there will always be a cat and mouse of, oh, we figured out how to game it, okay, well, we'll figure out how to make it harder to game, back and forth. But for things like, I think POAPs have been interesting for people just to say, oh, I've been to this thing, blah, blah, blah. But I think it would be hard to build anything on top of POAPs because they are so gameable. Like sometimes I get emails to events I RSVP'd to that I didn't even go to that have a POAP in them. And so there's nothing you can do if that POAP was able to give me some type of privileged access to something, then people would start to game that a lot more. As opposed to making things that are easily gameable, I would prefer to start with things that are much harder to game and work our way towards things that are harder to record, but we can figure out how to do that in a more verifiable way.
Yeah, I for sure have POAPs to things that I did not attend as well. And I know that there are a bunch of people out there who are POAP farmers. And if you just say POAP, like put out a tweet with POAP in it, you'll just get like swarmed with people trying to farm these POAPs. So speaking of, not being able to game the system, you started Metagame with these 3 NFT projects that you mentioned earlier in the podcast that you released from September to February. And these 3 projects are earned NFT projects. So can you talk a little bit about what you mean by earned NFTs?
Yeah. So these 3 were, so anyone can mint one. Every address can mint one of them. And the ardent attributes are based on your on-chain activity. So for instance, birth block is based on the timestamp of the first transaction you ever did in that wallet. The older it is, the more tree rings your birth block will have. And so if you just scroll through OpenSea, you can quickly be able to see which addresses are new and which addresses have been around for a long time. And there's even, I think, 3 people that have minted, 3 addresses that have minted NFTs, minted birth blocks, and they were part of the Genesis block. So they're as big as they can possibly get because their transaction was in the first transaction of Ethereum, which is pretty cool. And then Token Garden is every time you mint a new NFT, it'll grow another flower in your garden. And so it continues to evolve over time. And it's 1 per collection. So if you minted like 100 NFTs from the same collection, that still only counts as 1 flower. It'll be a little taller of a flower, but still only 1. So making it a little harder to game than just, oh, I'll make a collection and mint 100 of the same one. And then Heartbeat is based on data from multiple chains, how many transactions you've done in the last day, week, month, and forever. And so a bunch of the attributes are based on those parameters. And so if you wanted to game that, you can, but then you're doing, gas is a little cheaper now, but it would have used to cost a lot of money if you wanted to game the number of transactions and make your heart more beat faster and move around more.
I think these are super cool. Like I said, like I first found out about Token Garden, and so I've had my Token Garden for a little bit, and it's quite a nice garden now that I've had it for a while, and I've minted a bunch of NFTs in the process. And then I just minted Birth Block and Heartbeat as well. My Birth Block is pretty tiny because I was kind of late to the game. And then Heartbeat is always fun to see it sort of like grow or shrink depending on how active you are in the moment, which is really cool. So how do these 3 earned NFTs fit into the larger metagame?
Yeah, so these were experiments in taking on-chain data and creating art out of them. There's other protocols that are building on-chain credentials to use as credit, and maybe you get like a lower collateral rate, or at some point we want to get under collateralized lending on chain, the way that legacy finance has. But I think that's actually a lot farther out than we anticipate. I think that the way that we'll get people to start caring about getting their data into one place that we can start to use it for other, like, more economic uses will be for entertainment purposes, like for fun. I think that people will want to do it because it's fun. And so these earned NFTs are kind of the first step into, okay, can we then go an order of magnitude higher and make a bunch of different earned NFT art based on much more granular transactions? So how many different liquidity pools have you added liquidity to? Have you played pool together? Have you deposited ETH from 4 different centralized exchanges? Have you sent ETH to 20 different wallets that all have ENSs, meaning like, or have you sent ENSs to 20 different wallets, meaning have you invited new people, to, like, gotten people their first ENS, etc. And so, of course, some of that can be gamed, but it's like, these are the things that I think if people got cool art for doing, then they would be more interested in doing it, because kind of turning into a game of, oh, I did this thing and now I get like this cool trophy-esque item, but something that looks cooler than a trophy.
Yeah, I think like the direction this is going in is sort of like what ENS or like Unstoppable Domains or those like, domain NFT companies are doing, is turning what is originally just a string of letters and numbers into something that's more human readable. And you guys are trying to do that, not just with your wallet address, but with every blockchain hash, like every blockchain transaction. And so even with the 3 NFTs that you have launched so far, like if you just looked at my 3, you could at least know a few things about me. You can know how long I've been in this space, or at least, with this particular wallet. You can know like how active I am now. So maybe, if I had like a really big tree ring birth block, but my heartbeat was really small, maybe like I was an OG, but I don't really like participate in things anymore, at least with this wallet or something like that. And the idea is in the future, I can kind of see where this is going. In the future, do you see every blockchain transaction being able to be represented in some human readable way, whether it's with an NFT or whether it's with, some words or something like that? Like in 10 years, for instance, when people are doing things on blockchain, will they even know what a transaction hash is, or will it look completely different?
Yeah, one of my pet peeves is the fact that we still look at hashes all the time. I think that's way less readable. They don't mean anything in and of themselves. It's very like, oh, this is the best format for computers to do it, and we get a bunch of great things like they're all unique, etc. But it's a terrible way for humans to look at it. And so I think there's lots of better ways to take that information that that transaction has and put it into something human readable. So yes, I think in 10 years, all transactions will have something that's human readable, preferably in their place. And you can, if you need to click in to see it or whatever, that data will always be accessible. But I think in terms of what people will mostly look at, it will be something much more human readable. And another thing we put out with Metagame is called Anoma names. And it's basically a way that generates a first, middle, last name for any given address. And it's not unique by any means. Like there's only a couple million of these name combinations. And so you can definitely get collisions. But if you just look at an Etherscan page, the chance that you're going to have to Katie Salisbury's is really low. But at least every address will have a name so that you're not looking at these. You'd be able to see, oh, this same address or this same name did a bunch of transactions here versus being like, oh, 0xA247, 0xA247. And so, I think just like making stuff more human readable will also make things much more approachable for less technical folks.
Yeah, so I just I just connected my wallet to Anoma, anoma.themetagame.xyz, and my name is Miss Corja Blake Bernhard. So everybody, please refer to me as such from here on out. It's pretty fun. It's like I can now use that as my pseudonym almost, right? Like nobody will have. It's totally random. Like has nothing to do with my actual name or my actual identity, but that's just what Anoma told me my name is based on my wallet address, and so that's a fun little pseudonym.
Yeah, and I think it's a great thing for people to start with before they get an ENS. Like ENS, you can pick your name as long as someone else doesn't have it. But with Anoma names, it's just like, oh, here's kind of like one way to describe it would be like synthetic loot for ENS was what when I was talking to Mike at Rainbow about it. He's like, oh, this is synthetic loot for ENS. I was like, yeah, that's the best short one-liner for it.
Yeah, it's very cool. Okay, so what do you have planned for Metagame moving forward then? You've got these 3 earned NFTs right now. You have Anoma. What's next on the roadmap for you guys?
Yeah, so EVM Translator is what we've been working on for a while. So this next NFT we'll put out at the end of July, early August is called Logbook. And it's basically an aggregation of all of the transactions you've done in your wallet in human readable format. And in some ways, I think about it as like earned loot. Lots of people were really excited about, oh, I minted this thing or I bought this loot bag and it has these 8 or 12 items in it or whatever. And oh, if I have a dragon scale sword, maybe someone will make some cool art and like I'll get a dragon scale sword because that's in my loot bag. For Logbook, it's just going to be sentences on a page, but each of those sentences, you'll have to have done something or many things to earn that sentence on your page. And so when I think about what the metagame is, it's all of the games that can be built on top of all of those things that you've done. And so for now just starting with on-chain activity, but we would like to continue to bring in more and more types of data that are even more indicative of what you've done and what your values are. And I think if we want to scope it down a little bit for now, it's in what ways have you contributed to crypto, whether that's building or teaching more people about it or bringing more people in or making good designs for it or writing about it and explaining it to people, all of those things. How can we bring that information together and let people show that off in fun, artistic, aesthetically pleasing ways?
Very cool. And Metagame is all open source, right? So people can build other cool stuff on top of it.
Yes, the 3 earned NFTs we made, all of that code is open source. I think the thing that'll be most interesting for it being open source is EVM Translator. There are other things like Covalent that will decode transaction logs, but it's all closed source. And so this will be a open source version that you can just run on top of whatever transactions you have and decode the logs, and then a standard for interpreting those transactions into something human readable. And so we have a bunch of generic interpretations of transactions, but then we also have contract specific interpretations that match a given function call to what happened there. So for instance, Uniswap v2, it's very clear, like there's a couple different functions you can call to add liquidity, but if you've called added liquidity, then we know that action is added liquidity and a bunch of the metadata that comes with it. And so there's lots of contracts out there, and we would like to engage with all of the contract creators and have them make those mappings of, oh, if you call this function, here's the action that you took, and here's some of the other important pieces of data that were either inputs or outputs. And so that anywhere that you might see transactions, such as wallets, people can start to use these standards that contract creators write the interpretations for, and then you can start to understand what's actually happened in your wallet when you've made a given transaction.
Super cool. I can't wait to see what you guys build with that. I think this is much needed in the space, and you guys are making it fun as well. So really cool. Thanks for the conversation. I feel like this was a very like meta or hyper sort of conversation. It made me really think about, like think outside the box a little bit about like and like challenge my existing thinking, which is always a fun exercise to do. Last thing, Brenner, I finished every episode with a quick little game called This or That. And so if you're up for it, we'll just play this real quick. It only takes a minute or two.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So this or that, I'll say 2 words, A or B, and you tell me which one you prefer. There's no explanation needed. The idea is to go through it super fast. We'll just do a lightning round, and I've got 10 pairs of words for you. So first one, Bitcoin or Ethereum?
Ooh, Bitcoin.
Okay, crypto or Web3?
Crypto.
NFTs or DeFi?
NFTs.
Bear market or bull market?
Bear market.
Building or investing?
Building.
Books or podcasts?
Books.
Okay, appetizers or dessert?
Appetizers.
Austin or New York City?
New York City.
Past or future?
Future.
And last one, Earth or space?
Earth.
Okay, good job. You blew through that.
Yeah, a lot of people are going to be real mad at that Bitcoin one.
A lot of people have said that, like, you trying to cancel me with this game, but it's been good. No one's been canceled yet, so our listeners are pretty nice, so I think you'll be okay.
Okay,
and then
good. Yeah.
Last thing before you go, Brenner, tell people where they can find you if they want to follow you personally, and then also where people can go to learn more about Metagame, maybe get some earned NFTs for themselves, or just stay in the loop with what's happening coming up.
Yeah, so at Brenner Spear on Twitter and at Metagame on Twitter also. And by the time this podcast's out, we'll I'll have probably done the first and only time I'll do drop your ENS. And this will be a special drop your ENS where you'll send your response to Metabot, who is Metagame's Telegram bot. And that is how you'll get on the allow list for our next NFT logbook.
Very exciting. So if you're listening to this, go message Metabot on Telegram and get your whitelist spot. I'm definitely going to go do that right away. Thank you so much, Brenner, for taking the time to come on the podcast. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in, as always. And we'll be back again soon with another episode of Rehash.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Rehash, a Web3 podcast. The guest from this episode, Brenner, was self-nominated and voted onto the podcast by Triumph, Ellie Dots, and Julia. Some of the questions you heard were submitted by Karsten. Rehash is hosted by Diana Chen, produced and edited by Ellie Dots and Tyler Internet, and as always, supported by Rehash DAO. To stay up to date on all things Rehash, you can follow us on Twitter at RehashWeb3 and join our Discord to get involved.